It may sound like the Marine Corps has a lot of people in it, at just over 170,000 active duty Marines. But the reality is that if you stay in long enough, you really do run into the same people over and over again. And with the constant moves and the challenges that come with temporary living, you often rely on the kindness of strangers and friends. But when is someone a little too close to your family? The Wilson family took a subordinate's family under their wing. They offered them a space to do their laundry and engage socially. But, as one child alleged, all of this came at a cost. According to this family, Colonel Wilson not only abused their trust, he also abused their 6-year-old. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. I've included references for today's materials in the show notes. A quick warning that this episode discusses crimes against children. If this isn't the episode for you, no worries. I look forward to you joining me next time. Last episode, I mentioned we'd be flying out to North Carolina for our first encounter with a charge of conduct unbecoming. This was both metaphorically and literally true. Today's episode was recorded in the Queen City Podcast Network studios in Uptown Charlotte, and I'd like to thank QCPN for the generous gift of their space and time. I thought it would be fitting to cover a North Carolina case while I'm in North Carolina, so I picked a real doozy. Daniel Wilson, the son of missionaries, learned a lot when he grew up in Africa. His primary takeaway was to treat the little guy like a king, and that if you can make the most junior member of your team feel like he's the most important, you've earned his loyalty forever. Daniel Wilson enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1981 and trained in electronic warfare. He promoted to sergeant quickly and then, in the mid-1980s, applied for the enlisted to officer program, into which he was accepted. The Marine Corps sent him to the University of Arizona for 2.5 years. He was awarded a bachelor's degree in business administration. Degree in hand, Daniel Wilson earned his butter bars and commissioned as a second lieutenant in December 1988. Someone who commissions as an officer after being enlisted is often referred to as a Mustang. This is from Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt. But it says that the military unofficially uses the term Mustang to describe former enlisted officers because, while Mustangs can be tamed, they will always have a bit of a wild streak. Wilson attended the infantry officer course in Quantico, Virginia. The infantry are the ground forces for the Marine Corps. Their mission is to, quote, locate and destroy the enemy by fire and maneuver or repel their assault by fire and close combat. The infantry role requires high levels of fitness, mental toughness, and tactical abilities. If you've seen Marines in movies, they were likely infantry. An infantryman must be a master of fieldcraft and must be proficient in small arms, demolitions, rockets, and mortars. In 2007 and 2008, a young Captain Pointer was temporarily assigned to Wilson's command. Pointer is a pseudonym I've selected for today's case, to protect the anonymity of the victim and their family. Around the time Pointer and Wilson met in 2008, someone made an allegation that Wilson mishandled classified information, specifically a USB stick designated as secret. This was just the beginning of the misconduct in his career. Pointer and Wilson crossed paths again in 2015 in Okinawa, Japan. There, Colonel Wilson served as now Major Pointer's reporting supervisor. In the Marine Corps, officers and staff non-commissioned officers, also known as SNCOs, generally received annual fitness reports. These are basically the equivalent of civilian performance reviews. With fitness reports, the reporting supervisor grades the officer or SNCO and compares that person to all the other Marines of that rank that the RS has reviewed. That score is then converted onto a scale that goes from 80 to 100. For example, if a reporting supervisor has reviewed 20 majors, they'll have one major that is their 80 and one major that is their 100, and the rest will fall somewhere in between. Colonel Wilson gave Major Pointer a perfect score. Basically, Major Pointer was his 100, his rush crush. Colonel Wilson said Major Pointer was one of the top majors with whom he'd ever served, and he mentored Major Pointer during their time in Okinawa. In early 2016, Colonel Wilson prepared to rotate to Darwin, Australia. He was in line to serve as the officer in charge of a forward coordination element for the Marine Rotational Force. Colonel Wilson was to work as a liaison officer. He would be working with Australian forces. Colonel Wilson and his team would be the face of the Marine Corps in preparing for the rest of the rotational force. He and his mentee, Major Pointer, stayed in touch while Colonel Wilson was in Australia. And he really hit the ground running upon arriving in Darwin on February 16, 2016. Complaints soon surfaced about his lewd and drunken behavior, including allegations of drunken driving. In under 10 days, he built a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. He also made an inappropriate comment to another colonel's wife. In addition, he asked a subordinate Marine Corps captain to give him a copy of a revealing photograph of the captain's wife, along with a pair of her underwear. I don't know if he made this captain feel like he was the most important member of his team, but he did seem to have his loyalty. Colonel Wilson obtained a copy of the racy photograph and later showed it to an Australian commander. On February 24, 2016, Colonel Wilson used social media to send unprofessional, coarse, and crude Facebook messages to a female Australian major. He logged into a civilian employee's laptop and sent an email from her account, asking her supervisor on a date. Ultimately, it was an Australian commander that filed a complaint about Colonel Wilson and his behavior. 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, 3MEF, headquartered in Okinawa, Japan, maintained control over the Darwin Rotational Force, and on February 26, 2016, just 11 days into the planned 6-month rotation, the 3MEF commander, Lieutenant General Nicholson, fired Colonel Wilson from his Darwin billet. Colonel Wilson was immediately recalled to Okinawa. He pulled a Scaramucci a year before the mooch himself. However, aside from this firing and recall, the 3MEF commander took no further action. He did not direct a formal investigation. He also, surprisingly, did not add Colonel Wilson to the officer disciplinary notebook. This might sound like no one doodled his name in the margins of their English notebook, but the Officer Disciplinary Notebook, the ODN, is a big deal. The ODN is not actually a notebook, although it allegedly started out as a little black book that the Commandant of the Marine Corps maintained with notes of all of his misbehaving officers. Now, and when Colonel Wilson's Darwin issues came up, the ODN is a web-based electronic database that the Commandant maintains that has case details, procedural history, and other information on officers that are alleged to have committed misconduct. The commandants take officer misconduct very seriously, and the idea is they want to be able to easily check on the status of officer misconduct cases. There is a Marine Corps order that directs all commanding generals, that is, all officers with stars on their collars, to report alleged officer misconduct on the ODN. The standard is deliberately low. Any offense for which the officer could be separated. There are usually between 250 and 350 officers on the ODN at any one time. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, the most common offense is a DUI. However, Lieutenant General Nicholson decided not to report Colonel Wilson onto the ODN. Lieutenant General Nicholson was, apparently, skeptical about the allegations against Wilson. He believed it boiled down to not understanding drunken, lewd humor. Without conducting an investigation, he instead asked Colonel Wilson for his side of the story. Unsurprisingly, Colonel Wilson downplayed his behavior and made it seem as though Australian military personnel blew his behavior out of proportion. Without an investigation, Lieutenant General Nicholson concluded that Colonel Wilson hadn't broken the law, he'd just been stupid. One of the ODN's primary purposes is to prevent officer misconduct from being swept under the rug, which is exactly what happened with Colonel Wilson's behavior in Darwin. What's more is that it's unlikely that any of this misconduct in Australia would have come to light if the remainder of Colonel Wilson's 2016 had gone smoothly. After his disgraceful firing from the Darwin rotation, Colonel Wilson transferred to Camp Lejeune. In April 2016, he moved into on-base housing with his wife, Mrs. Wilson. While Colonel Wilson was in Okinawa, Mrs. Wilson lived in Beaufort, South Carolina. Colonel Wilson, in his new job at Camp Lejeune, served as the operations officer for the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, 2MEF. Some will take umbrage with me pronouncing it Lejeune and will instead tell you that it's pronounced Lejeune. I can't bring myself to add an R where there isn't one, and we're going to get through this together. In the summer of 2016, Major Pointer and his family also moved to Camp Lejeune from Okinawa. The move, predictably, was challenging. The family of 5 and 2 dogs bounced around with family members for a month before getting to Lejeune, where they stayed in 2 different extended stay hotels. They didn't always have access to a working washer and dryer during this time, and they also didn't have the contents of their home. The Pointer family stopped by the Wilson household, where Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Pointer met for the first time, though they very quickly became friends. Mrs. Wilson opened the Wilson house to the Pointer family, inviting them over anytime they wanted to do laundry during this tough season of transition, or if they just needed a change of scenery from the cramped extended stay hotel. This felt like respite after the storm of an international move and uncertainty about when they'd finally be back in a stable home. The families grew accustomed to socializing, having dinners together often. The children would climb over Colonel Wilson, often sitting on his lap. He invited them to call him Uncle Dan. Colonel Wilson and Major Pointer began working out together. They worked out almost every weekday morning and would catch up about their families and work. Eventually, the Pointer family moved into base housing on June 28, 2016. They hadn't yet received their household goods shipment, and they wouldn't for another month. On June 29, 2016, Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Pointer, and the 3 Pointer daughters went for pedicures and lunch. The Pointer family went to the Wilsons' house for a cookout that night. The Pointers had 3 daughters, 2 6-year-old twins who I'll refer to as BP and MP, and 1 10-year-old who I will refer to as SP. BP played washers with Colonel Wilson in the yard. They were still around everyone else at the cookout. Later, BP sat in Colonel Wilson's lap while they were alone in the living room. On July 3, 2016, Colonel Wilson and Major Pointer worked together to build the trampoline that Major Pointer had purchased for his daughters. Colonel Wilson again invited the Pointer family over for dinner. Major Pointer went fishing in the river near Colonel Wilson's house at that time. 2 of his daughters visited with him while he fished. But BP stayed with Colonel Wilson in the living room, sitting in his lap for a majority of the evening. On July 8th, the Wilsons again hosted the Pointer family for dinner. Major Pointer got stuck working late to write up a situation report about a hazing incident in the barracks. Mrs. Pointer took the girls over for dinner herself. Again, BP spent the majority of the evening sitting in Colonel Wilson's lap. Mrs. Pointer recalled later at trial that at one point Colonel Wilson inexplicably went into a bathroom and washed his hands, then into a small unused room known as the maids' quarters for about 5 minutes before rejoining the group. The next morning, Colonel Wilson came to the Pointer home unannounced. Major Pointer testified that he wanted to check on us and see if we needed any groceries. Then, Major Pointer said, Colonel Wilson asked to be invited in. Mrs. Pointer and Major Pointer remember Colonel Wilson saying he'd found some panties that were too small to belong to Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Pointer believed that they were her underwear, mixed up from the laundry. When they discussed the impact of moving and the difference in the cost of living allowance, Colonel Wilson asked if they needed money, saying, "What's a couple $1,000s between family?" On July 11th, that next day, Mrs. Wilson returned a pair of BP's underwear to Mrs. Pointer. Colonel Wilson had set them aside in the laundry room. On July 12th, Major Pointer got wrapped up at work again and couldn't join the families for a late lunch. Mrs. Pointer spent time with Mrs. Wilson in the kitchen while the children played. BP again stayed in the living room with Colonel Wilson for the several hours they were at the Wilson house. Mrs. Pointer recalled Colonel Wilson again washing his hands seemingly randomly, or at least without explanation. Again, she recalled, he disappeared into the maids' quarters for a few minutes. Mrs. Pointer and Mrs. Wilson had formed a fast friendship. In many of these visits and family dinners, they would partner off and spend their time talking. Mrs. Pointer testified that Mrs. Wilson told her about some concerns she had about her marriage, that Colonel Wilson had asked Mrs. Wilson if she would engage in a three-way sexual encounter with another man. Mrs. Pointer found this information shocking, and this information altered how she saw Colonel Wilson. On July 13th, the Wilsons hosted the Pointer family and Dr. Academic for dinner. Dr. Academic is another pseudonym, and he was a close friend of the Pointer family. He was in town to deliver a professional military education lecture to Major Pointer's unit. That night at the Wilsons' home, Colonel Wilson urged Mrs. Pointer to sit on his lap. He repeatedly asked her to do so, and despite her reluctance, she acquiesced. Colonel Wilson also gave BP a $10 bill that night. He said he gave BP $10 because BP won a bet. Later, while the children were playing with Colonel Wilson, BP's twin sister pushed her off the couch because BP was lifting her shirt to show her outie belly button to Colonel Wilson. Both Major Pointer and Mrs. Pointer reminded BP that she didn't need to be showing anyone her belly button, that she shouldn't lift up her shirt for others. Mrs. Wilson took the other children upstairs and left Mrs. Pointer to talk with BP in the kitchen. Mrs. Pointer was concerned and wondered why BP would lift her shirt to show Colonel Wilson her belly button. Mrs. Pointer told BP that if anyone asks to see up there, BP could always say no, that she didn't have to show anybody anything, that her chest was a private place, like down below. BP said twice that Colonel Wilson hadn't touched her, but then she told her mother that Colonel Wilson had touched her genital area, that she didn't like it and that it hurt. BP said that while Colonel Wilson touched her, he told her she was a good girl, that she was his favorite girl. Mrs. Wilson and the other children returned during this conversation, so Mrs. Pointer took BP into the restroom to try and get to the bottom of what exactly was happening in the Wilson home. She asked BP to show her what Colonel Wilson did, and BP disclosed that Colonel Wilson placed his hand inside her underwear and touched her. Mrs. Pointer told BP that she loved her so much, that she was so brave, and that they would never come back to the Wilson household, that Colonel Wilson would never touch her like that again. Mrs. Pointer burst from the bathroom and told the kids to get out of the house. She told them, "We have to go for your own safety, for everything. We have to go now." Mrs. Pointer told Major Pointer that Colonel Wilson had touched their daughter. Accounts differ on who else was around when Mrs. Pointer confronted Colonel Wilson, whether the children were still in the home at that point. Mrs. Pointer called him a bastard. Colonel Wilson asked what he did. Mrs. Pointer told him he knew exactly what he did. He knew damn well what he did. The Pointer family then left the home, waiting briefly for Dr. Academic to retrieve his belongings. Once back to their sparse lodging, because remember, their household goods hadn't been delivered yet, Major Pointer walked Dr. Academic back to his hotel room. Stories vary on what Major Pointer and Mrs. Pointer said to their children on the night of July 13th. It's unclear how much information they shared about the disclosures BP made, or whether they questioned their other daughters about their experiences with Colonel Wilson. Dr. Academic emailed Colonel Wilson to state he would not deliver the professional military education lecture and left the next morning, July 14th. Later, on July 14th, BP sat for a forensic interview to memorialize her memories of what happened. Forensic interviewing is a technique for gathering information from an alleged victim or witness, and it's often used when interviewing children. They are typically conducted in spaces designed to be comfortable for children, and they're handled by trained professionals. The technique is designed to gather information without suggestive or leading questions. It's a technique made with the suggestibility of children in mind. This forensic interview was recorded and later shown to the panel at trial. Major Pointer called Colonel Wilson and confronted him over the allegations. Colonel Wilson again denied touching any of the girls inappropriately, but encouraged Major Pointer to do what his gut and conscience told him to. Colonel Wilson told Major Pointer that Dr. Academic suggested Colonel Wilson speak with Major Pointer. Dr. Academic later testified that he did no such thing. Major Pointer told Colonel Wilson not to call him or come around to the Pointer family home, then abruptly hung up. Fortunately, Major Pointer had already followed his gut. The night before, Major Pointer consulted his chain of command and, along with Mrs. Pointer, called 911. NCIS and officers from the Provost Marshal's office responded and took statements from the Pointer adults. NCIS was listening in on that call between Major Pointer and Colonel Wilson. The investigation didn't turn up any physical evidence, beyond a very small amount of unidentifiable male DNA inside a pair of BP's underwear. It's not clear whether this was the underwear BP was wearing during the reported assault, if it was the underwear Colonel Wilson allegedly found and returned by way of his wife, or if this was some other pair of underwear. The Pointer sisters were all forensically interviewed in July 2016. BP indicated that Colonel Wilson touched her inappropriately about 6 times. After his arrest, Colonel Wilson was not placed in confinement. He reportedly began drinking heavily. In comments made to the press, it seemed like the theme was that the spurious allegations drove Colonel Wilson to drink, and that it was because of these allegations that he began to experience problems with drinking. I'd like to remind everyone that clearly there was an issue with his drinking in Australia. It's part of why he was fired so quickly. In late 2016, the Wilson family cat, Jimmy, was struck by a car in a hit-and-run on base. He passed, and this drove Colonel Wilson to Facebook. He wrote that someone, quote, killed our adopted son Jimmy and left him to effing die in the street. He threatened that if he found that mother effer, he would break every bone in their body. Mrs. Wilson asked him to delete this post, but Colonel Wilson wasn't quick enough. Someone sent a screenshot to the base authority. As a result, Colonel Wilson was debarred from the base. Access to his home, his office, and other base facilities was cut off. Debarment means being excluded from base access, or amenities access. It's functionally being expelled from the base. It can apply to civilians, like service member families, but it also can apply to service members themselves. Anyone who is a threat to the peace and security of the base can be debarred. The installation commander, with input from the Marines' chain of command, makes the ultimate decision on whether or not to debar an active duty service member from the base. I used to think it was really uncommon for people to be debarred from base, but at a rough estimate, I'd say I meet 1 to 2 people each year who share that they've been debarred from a base. To be fair, I do have a face that says, tell me your whole life story and don't leave out the scandals. On Christmas Day 2016, family friends, the Walshes, visited with the Wilson family. Given the debarment, I am assuming this was at an off-base residence or some kind of temporary accommodation, but I can't find specifics of just where the Wilson family was living on December 25, 2016. Colonel Wilson was again drinking that day, seemingly a trend during this season of his life. Colonel Wilson continued to talk about Jimmy, the cat that he dearly missed. Most of the Walsh family left, but Jerry, a friend of Mrs. Wilson, stayed behind. Later, Jerry accepted an offer to sleep over, having drank a little too much to drive home safely. They all decided to go upstairs to the primary bedroom, the only room of the house with cable TV. Colonel Wilson and Jerry Walsh took the sides of the bed, with Mrs. Wilson in the middle. Jerry Walsh alleged that in the middle of the night on Christmas Day 2016, she awoke to Colonel Wilson's hand on her face. She pretended to be asleep and said his hand returned and he put his finger in her mouth. She bit his finger, rose, and hid in the bathroom before going downstairs to find somewhere else to sleep. Mrs. Wilson awoke, found her friend absent, and went downstairs to join her. On December 26, 2016, Jerry Walsh and Mrs. Wilson prepared for their planned 4-day trip to Beaufort, South Carolina. Jerry Walsh was looking for a home to buy. Spur of the moment, and without obtaining approval from his command, Colonel Wilson announced he would join them so that he could visit friends living near the Marine Corps base at Parris Island. Upon arriving in Beaufort, the women checked into their hotel while Colonel Wilson visited his friends. Later, he returned to the room and, quote, passed out on a couch in an adjoining room. Jerry Walsh drew a penis on Colonel Wilson's face with a black eyeliner pencil. Mrs. Wilson took a photo, which is available in one of the linked sources for those who are interested. Jerry Walsh alleged that 2 days after she drew the diddly doodle on Colonel Wilson's face on the night of December 28th, Colonel Wilson sexually assaulted her. Jerry Walsh and Mrs. Wilson did not expect Colonel Wilson back that night, so they shared the bed in the primary bedroom. Colonel Wilson did return around midnight and claimed that he did not enter the primary bedroom. This is a claim his wife echoes. Nevertheless, Jerry Walsh alleged that Colonel Wilson digitally penetrated her through her pajama bottoms while she was immobilized due to a medicine for an injured neck, and that Colonel Wilson pinned her to the mattress. These allegations were similar to the claims BP made about her experience with Colonel Wilson, though articulated more clearly and more concisely. That is, he penetrated both of them digitally through their clothing. Jerry, an adult, had a full range of experience and vocabulary to explain what she recalled feeling. Jerry stated that in the aftermath of the assault, Mrs. Wilson rubbed her head and told Jerry it was going to be okay. After returning to Camp Lejeune, the friendship between Mrs. Wilson and Jerry Walsh dissolved. Mrs. Wilson texted her friend on January 11th to say, "You have hurt my feelings, Jerry. I knew you and Dan were texting secretly." Also on January 11th, Colonel Wilson checked himself into a local rehab facility. He says he put himself in detox. On January 12th, Jerry wrote to Mrs. Wilson to say, quote, "You set me up. You know what a horrible person he is. What were you hoping would happen? I haven't slept in weeks. How do you sleep at night? You know what he is. I hope you are bawling your eyes out every single day and night like I am. You know what he did. You're not a victim. You're an accomplice." Colonel Wilson's legal team contended that the dissolution of the friendship was the reason behind the sexual assault report that Jerry Walsh filed on January 12th, not the other way around. The defense team said that Jerry and Colonel Wilson exchanged flirtatious text messages. They claimed Mrs. Wilson found out about the text messages and ended the friendship. When Jerry made her report, she'd also revealed that Colonel Wilson took that unauthorized trip to Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort. On January 13, 2017, NCIS interviewed Colonel Wilson about the unauthorized trip to Beaufort, and on January 14th, Major General Miller ordered him confined to the brig. The brig is a military jail or prison and ranged from afloat brigs that you'd find on a ship like the USS Essex or the USS Teddy Roosevelt to consolidated brigs like the Naval Consolidated Brig aboard Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, all the way up to the United States Disciplinary Barracks aboard Fort Leavenworth. The Disciplinary Barracks is one of 3 prisons on Fort Leavenworth property, and it houses the military's death row inmates and those serving sentences longer than 10 years. Over the course of 1 year, a highly decorated colonel was fired from his job for drunken shenanigans, accused of sexually assaulting a child, debarred from base over social media threats, began drinking heavily, he'd gone AWOL, he'd checked himself into rehab, and he'd been accused of sexually assaulting Jerry Walsh. In March 2017, a more highly skilled forensic interviewer re-interviewed the Pointer sisters and tried to get more specifics from BP. This was notably 8 months after the disclosure. And do you remember General Nicholson, the commander of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force in Okinawa, the one who'd concluded, without any investigation, that Colonel Wilson hadn't broken the law, he'd just been stupid and had a quirky sense of humor the Aussies didn't understand? If that conclusion didn't sit well with you, I have an update. The Inspector General of the Marine Corps investigated what happened and what didn't happen in the fallout from the Darwin firing. The IG concluded that General Nicholson failed to comply with his requirements to investigate alleged officer misconduct and to report that conduct via the ODN. The Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Glenn Walters, gave General Nicholson a formal reprimand. For General Nicholson, this was a career ender. He retired in August 2018 after 39 years in the Marine Corps. Marine Corps prosecutors charged Colonel Wilson with 24 specifications alleging unauthorized absence, rape of a child, sexual abuse of a child, battery, and 6 specifications of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Conduct unbecoming means actions or behavior which, in dishonoring or disgracing the officer, seriously compromises his standing as an officer. The manual for courts-martial includes examples like the dishonorable failure to pay a debt, cheating on an exam, being drunk and disorderly in public, an officer failing to support their family, or, more generally, committing a crime that involves moral turpitude. Moral turpitude basically means it's immoral, unethical, or unjust. The 2022 NDAA amended Article 133 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and removed, quote, "and a gentleman." Now it's just conduct unbecoming an officer. Previous iterations tried to define gentleman to include women and stated, as used in this article, gentleman includes both male and female commissioned officers, cadets, and midshipmen. The term gentleman connotes failing in an officer's personal character, regardless of gender. It feels like a big step forward to update this language to reflect an evolving military where, gasp, women with college degrees serve as officers. Next, I hope we can drop calling someone like me a female lawyer and just call me a lawyer instead. The charges brought against Colonel Wilson included charges for licking and striking both BP and her twin sister MP, and for offering alcohol, specifically whiskey, to BP, MP, and their older sister, SP. I don't have any more information on the facts around the allegations of licking and striking either of the girls, nor is there much information on the public record around offering alcohol to children. The charges for conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman were related to his conduct in Darwin. His trial began on August 29, 2017. The rule for selecting a panel is that panel members must be senior to the accused. This was a colonel, which made it tough to find higher-ranking officers than Colonel Wilson. The panel would have to be either all generals or be colonels that had been colonels longer than Colonel Wilson was a colonel. Ultimately, the panel included 4 generals and 3 colonels. That's a lot of brass sitting in judgment. The court-martial lasted 10 days. Colonel Wilson did not testify, and Mrs. Wilson claimed spousal privilege in order to decline testifying for the prosecution. The 3 minor children of the Pointer family all testified, as did their parents. Jerry Walsh also testified. At trial, defense counsel impeached Mrs. Pointer when she recalled the conversation she had with BP in the bathroom. At trial, Mrs. Pointer testified that in the initial kitchen conversation, BP was the person to bring up touching private places, which the Pointer family referred to as their, quote, privacy. In her written statement to NCIS from July 14, 2016, Mrs. Pointer wrote that she was the first to bring up touching private places, saying, "Just like no one should look at or touch our privacy, people should not ask you to lift up your shirt." Impeachment refers to the process of undermining the credibility of a witness during trial, and it's accomplished by asking questions that reveal inconsistencies. Here, the defense team confirmed that her in-court testimony was that BP brought up touching first. Then, they asked if she recalled meeting with NCIS on July 14th. They asked if the events were more fresh in her mind on July 14th or 13 months later during the trial. They asked whether she'd typed the statement herself. They confirmed that NCIS agents did not rush her, that she was given the opportunity to review the statement to make corrections, and that she initialed each paragraph. They reminded Mrs. Pointer, and the jury, that she swore that her written statement was true when she gave it. Impeachment is effective because it makes the witness sound like a liar, and it makes a jury or panel question whether they are lying today or whether they were lying when they made their first statement. It also makes the panel wonder what else someone might be lying about. Some of the most challenging facts to read about were the changes to BP's affect after her disclosure. BP, previously so independent, became clingy. She didn't want to go to the bathroom alone and didn't want her father or anyone else to bathe her. She sought continued reassurances that her parents loved her and would become inexplicably angry and would hide away. The panel members weighed everything they heard in the court-martial of Colonel Wilson. They evaluated the testimony that BP provided in court, which was sometimes at odds with her forensic interview. They heard from experts about the reliability of child witnesses. They took into account the defense's cross-examination of Mrs. Pointer and their effective impeachment of her. And they convicted Colonel Wilson of one specification of sexual abuse of a child on diverse occasions, 6 specifications of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, and 1 specification of unauthorized absence. He was acquitted on the sexual assault of Jerry Walsh and of the rape of BP. On September 10, 2017, that panel of Marines sentenced Colonel Wilson to 66 months confinement and dismissal from the United States Marine Corps. They also reduced him 1 rank to lieutenant colonel. The father of the minors at the heart of this case said, "I hope that the courage of my child will allow other victims to be free of the evil Wilson has done and perhaps have the courage to come forward. We believe we are just the tip of the iceberg." And for the Marine Corps safety brief, keep your honor clean and keep yourself out of other families' underwear, clean or otherwise. I'm glad you stuck with me, Legal Beagle, because the post-conviction action on this case was so monumental that it inspired Congress to reform military criminal justice. Kind of. Colonel Wilson filed appeals of his conviction and made various assignments of error claims. The most important one, the one that mattered to his appeal, was the allegation that the government did not introduce sufficient evidence at trial to convict him of the child's sexual assaults. This claim is called factual insufficiency. At the time, the test for factual sufficiency was whether, after weighing the evidence in the record of trial and making allowances for not having personally observed the witnesses, the members of the Court of Appeals are themselves convinced of the accused's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They must take a fresh, impartial look at the evidence and need not give deference to the trial court, beyond the fact that the trial court heard and saw the witnesses. The NMCCA concluded that the inconsistencies in BP's testimony rendered the evidence insufficient to find Colonel Wilson guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. NMCCA had direct access to 2 recorded items: the video recording of the forensic interview of BP from July 2016 and the audio recording of the pretextual phone call Major Pointer made to Colonel Wilson. They placed a great deal of weight on these. In footnote 103, the Navy Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals critiqued how the taped forensic interview went, noting that BP was playing with Play-Doh during the entire interview. When she answered a specific question, she did not look up at the interviewer. The question was whether Colonel Wilson's hand went under her underwear, and she asserted that it was under. I don't have a 6-year-old, but I don't see why playing with Play-Doh made her answer not credible. Just because a 6-year-old didn't look up to answer doesn't mean the answer was a lie. If the interview was exclusively audio, how would the court have decided? The court further noted that at the trial, BP was not articulate during her trial testimony, and the court lamented that she provided some nonverbal responses and at times no response at all. They cited the forensic interview given in a comfortable space, speaking one-on-one with a trained professional, and said that she was capable of being articulate. This all sat really poorly with me, as though the court didn't or couldn't or wouldn't understand that sitting across the well of the courtroom from her alleged assailant had an impact on the child that was testifying. Nevertheless, in court, BP testified that Colonel Wilson put his fingers inside of her. That seems pretty articulate to me. After testifying to what she experienced, BP added, quote, "Then I didn't really want to be his best buddy anymore." Listen, I am definitely biased towards this little girl, but that quote is heartbreaking. The NMCCA cited the lack of other witnesses, physical evidence, or admissions of guilt by Colonel Wilson as things they would have needed to overcome the inconsistencies of BP's testimony. And I'm really struggling with this conclusion. An estimated 86% of child sexual abuse goes unreported altogether. Children may not initially understand that they are being abused and likely lack the language to explain what is going on in the detail that the court was looking for. Lengthy delays in disclosure for reported cases are common, and younger children typically have longer delays in reporting. Delays in reporting make it unlikely that physical evidence remains unadulterated. Delays in reporting make it harder to recall the chronology and details of abuse. Perhaps that's why, at trial, over a year after her report, BP had a challenging time recounting specific details. The court attributed the grabbing, pain, and burning BP experienced at Colonel Wilson's hand to him repositioning her on his lap. They decided that by putting his hand on her crotch and pulling to scoot her up on his lap, it, quote, may have caused friction and discomfort. They belabored that BP, as a child, was susceptible to suggestion. They believed Mrs. Pointer and the forensic interviewer may have inadvertently altered BP's perceptions. They reasoned that when Colonel Wilson said he'd only ever been alone with MP outside the house, the hours BP spent in his lap, without others in the room, didn't count because there were other adults in the home. Ultimately, the NMCCA concluded that BP was inconsistent regarding whether abuse happened, when it happened, how many times it happened, and what precisely happened. The Manual for Courts-Martial bars reconsideration of findings of factual insufficiency, and that means the government didn't get another shot at prosecuting Colonel Wilson for the child sex abuse convictions. The NMCCA upheld the convictions for being absent without leave and the 6 counts of conduct unbecoming, and authorized a sentencing rehearing. They did, however, offer that, in the alternative, the convening authority may approve a sentence of no punishment. In 2018, the Pointer family filed a $25 million lawsuit against the United States Marine Corps, claiming Colonel Wilson's behavior during his deployment to Australia should have raised red flags. They believed that the Marine Corps' failure to punish Wilson for his behavior in Darwin cost their daughter her innocence, an unforgivable act. The family has been vocal advocates for military justice reform, and their efforts will reverberate in the military community. The 2021 National Defense Authorization Act updated Article 66 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The update provides that a court of criminal appeals can only reverse a conviction where appellate judges are clearly convinced that the conviction was against the weight of the evidence. This is a higher standard than the prior rule, which authorized the courts of criminal appeals to overturn when they were merely convinced that the evidence was insufficient. The rationale behind the update was that the previous standard, allowing factual sufficiency review, was a relic of a time before there were judges or even many lawyers involved in courts-martial, back when courts-martial were like the Wild West. In the 1940s, there was a well-documented fear that courts-martial couldn't or wouldn't overcome command influence. Factual sufficiency review was created to bolster the faith that service members had in military justice. It was important back then for military appellate judges to have the authority to completely reassess a conviction. While this update rippled through the military justice community, I sort of feel like it's a distinction without a difference. The standard that the NMCCA used here in Colonel Wilson's case was that they had to themselves be convinced the accused was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Is that so different than being clearly convinced that there was not proof beyond a reasonable doubt? After Wilson's convictions were overturned in July 2019, he was released from the brig, and the Marine Corps placed him on leave status at Camp Pendleton, just north of San Diego, California. In October 2019, Daniel Wilson and the Marine Corps came to an agreement that avoided a resentencing hearing. Instead of resentencing Daniel Wilson for the 6 counts of conduct unbecoming and 1 count of being AWOL, Daniel Wilson would submit a retirement request. The 2 MEF commanding general recommended approval of Wilson's retirement request, but recommended he also leave the Marine Corps with an other than honorable characterization of service, and recommended busting him down to major. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Manpower and Reserve Affairs accepted and approved his retirement at the rank of lieutenant colonel and characterized his service as other than honorable. I don't know that Daniel Wilson got that memo, as his LinkedIn page proudly proclaims that in March 2020, he retired as the most senior colonel in the Marine Corps, just shy of 39 years of service. He now serves as a life coach, and as with all life coaches and Instagram influencers, I hope everyone takes his advice with a grain or 2 of salt. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone that you also think would enjoy it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and other feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com. Join me next time when we take a leap of faith out of an airplane. Until then, take care.